Hi, this is Philip Cotro with depthsofpentecost.com, teachings that bring you deeper into the Word of God. I'm a Christian blogger, a Bible teacher, soon-to-be author as well. Last week we talked about why the book of Galatians was written. This is a series we're doing on why the books of the New Testament were written to help us gain better understanding and better historical context. So to recap from last week, if you remember, Paul planted 4 churches across the region of South Galatia. Galatians was the first book written in the New Testament. That was in AD 49. And when he planted those 4 churches, a group of people called the Judaizers, who were Christian converts, but they were also radical Jews who believed that in order to convert to Christianity, one had to convert to Judaism first. And they were appalled at the idea that Gentiles could become Christians without being circumcised and going through all of the yearly festivals of Judaism and observing the law and obeying the kosher diet. And Paul was adamant that God isn't concerned with those things anymore in the New Testament age, under the New Covenant. Now that Jesus has died on the cross, God is concerned with our hearts and whether or not we really love God versus whether or not we still obey the old Jewish rituals. So, this is the great debate raging in Christianity this early on in the early church. So with more and more Gentiles converting to Christianity, there's that question, that dilemma of where does Judaism play in? Where does the 10 Commandments play in? Where does the law of Moses come in? And some Jewish believers really want the Gentiles to abandon their culture, to stop eating shellfish, to get circumcised, to do all the things they have to do to become proselytes, which is Gentile Jewish converts. So with this debate going on, in AD 50, Paul and Barnabas traveled to Jerusalem to ask the original 12 what they think of this. Because one of the accusations that the Judaizers are able to make is that Paul was not one of the original 12. He didn't actually know Jesus and walk with him. And so really to get to the truth, a lot of Christians agree that we need to ask what the original 12, what Peter and James and John, what they thought of that. So Paul and Barnabas travel to Jerusalem, and they meet with Peter, and they meet with the others that are still there, and some of the Judaizers show up as well. And the Judaizers, like I said in last week's video, were never actually named. Their leader is never named. Paul refers to him 3 times throughout the New Testament as the thorn in my flesh. So they have a big debate here in Jerusalem, even though Christianity has pretty much been outlawed and they're pretty much in Jerusalem an underground movement. They still gather and they have a big meeting, and this is called the Jerusalem Council. It takes place in AD 50. So this big debate is going on. It was like watching a modern news channel. You have the 2 talking heads on each side on Fox News or on CNN. You have the 2 sides debating about politics or whatever. So on one side you had Peter and Paul and Barnabas, and on the other side you had the Judaizers arguing about what place the law has in Christianity, which is still a new faith, and what Gentile converts need to do. What degree do they need to go to adopt a Jewish identity to become Christians? So James, who is the half-brother of Jesus, he's another son of Mary, he agrees with Peter as well. He comes here and he sits down, he listens in on it. So just because he was personally related or connected to Jesus, obviously his say-so has a lot of clout in the meeting. And Peter, however, is really technically the leader of Christianity at this point. He's the one that Jesus said, "I will build my rock upon this, my church upon this rock." So Peter, his voice is really going to carry the most say-so in what the decision is. So after listening to both sides, Peter stands up and he pretty much says, "I agree with Paul and Barnabas. I agree that the Gentiles don't need to fully convert to Judaism and don't need to be circumcised or live by a kosher diet to become Christians and to go to heaven." So the Judaizers are pretty much defeated. And so they have an official agreement on this. They actually have a vote in a council. They decide that the Gentiles don't have to be circumcised. They don't have to obey a kosher diet, but they do need to give something. So there's kind of an agreement that has to be made here. And the only requirement they place on Gentiles in order to become Christians and to be truly welcomed into the family of Christ is that the Gentiles should not eat meat that has been sacrificed to idols. And that's kind of confusing to us today, and it's one of those ancient customs that we we look back on it today and we don't fully understand it. But back in those times, it was possible that your neighbor would worship an idol like Zeus or Jupiter and would sacrifice their goat or their ox. And then, since that was sacrificed, it was considered like demonic meat. And they may ask you as your neighbor to share some with you. So back then, they considered it like sinful to partake in this meat that has been sacrificed to this idol god. And so that's the agreement that they reached. The Gentiles should not eat meat from animals that have been sacrificed to idol gods. And that's really pretty much the only real burden that's placed upon Gentiles. Other than that, they don't have to be circumcised. They're free to eat whatever else they want as far as shellfish or whatever goes against the Levitical diet. So Paul and Barnabas are sent back to Antioch with Judas Barsabbas and Silas, who will later become Paul's traveling companion, taking Barnabas' place. The reason these two men are sent is because, like I said, by this point, I said this last week, Antioch of Syria has really become the central headquarters of Christianity now, since it has been driven out of Jerusalem. So Paul and Barnabas go, but they bring these two other men with them just to authenticate this is what the original 12 ruled on. This is what the council decided on. And so there's really great rejoicing. There's hand clapping and patting on the back. But now the real question is, because the church overall has accepted this as the official stance, but did this resolve the problem? Does this really solve everything? Well, we still have a lot of books of the New Testament left that still address this, so clearly this wasn't a done issue in most people's eyes. So at a nearby church in Palestine, there's a crisis that's already begun to arise. This is shortly after the Jerusalem Council. And the problem is that they have is that there's limited agriculture, and so that can't support this church in Palestine, which has a growing population. So there's a lot of poor people, and there's a lot of hunger and a lot of famine going on in this church. And there's a lot of wealthy landowners that are oppressing the Christians because a lot of the Christians are poor and impoverished, and wealthy landowners will confiscate Christians' land, and in their court proceedings, they'll actually accuse them. They'll point to them and they'll say, look, these guys are Christians and therefore they need to have their land taken from them. It's a form of persecution, sort of in an economic form. So this is a crisis taking place in the Palestinian church. There's also an influx of Hellenistic goods coming into the region. And some Christians are starting to say, wait a minute, why do we need to sit here and stay poor? Why don't we get in on this? So some Christians actually start to go out and strive to become wealthy merchants. And you actually have a new class of wealthy Christians arriving in this church in Palestine. And so what this leads to is that it's afflicted with a great divide between the rich and the poor. And some Christians are getting wealthy, and the church is even beginning to show them favoritism. So we have some wealthy Christians in the church who are the biggest donors and the biggest tithe payers, and then the church is sort of showing them a lot more favoritism and sort of not really all that interested in helping the needs of the poorer Christians in their congregation. Now, does that sound like a familiar problem? Because I've seen that happen in churches today. So that's a problem that has plagued Christianity from the very earliest days. And a bigger problem soon emerges after that. And perhaps unsurprisingly, some bad information has reached the Palestinian church about the Jerusalem Council, about the decision that they reached. And so one of the things that they hear about the ruling is kind of going too far in what the ruling actually was. So they start to believe, they hear through the grapevine that they had ruled that the law, the Old Testament law, was completely undone. And in fact, there's no standards anymore, and there's no reason to even abstain from sin. And so now people in the church can live any way they want to. And so the Palestinian Christians just say, well, forget that. If the law has been completely abolished, then they stop obeying the Ten Commandments, and they start living any way they want to, and they start going out and committing fornication, and they start going out and getting drunk and doing all these other sinful behaviors. So once again, that's not what the council ruling was, but people are sort of taking it as license to live any way they want to. Once again, I ask you, isn't that a familiar sounding problem? That's a problem that the churches today. That's an epidemic in the churches in America today. I can live any way I want to and still be a Christian. And I don't have to abstain from sin, and I'm still going to heaven when I die. So, news of this terrible problem, these three problems, reaches the Apostle James, who's also known as James the Just. Again, the half-brother of Jesus. So a man with a lot of clout and authority within the church. And so he writes a letter in AD 50. This is the second letter written of the New Testament to the Palestinian church shortly after the Jerusalem Council. And basically, the book of James has a threefold mission. First of all, it's to encourage those Christians who are enduring economic persecution in the Palestinian region. It's to rebuke the favoritism the church is showing towards the wealthier among their congregation. And it's also to set the record straight against on what the Jerusalem Council had really ruled and what it was all about. And so James puts a huge emphasis on holiness and righteous living. And because there were kind of rumors that had gotten started and false information that had reached the church about what the Jerusalem Council was all about, there's a real interesting emphasis on James, especially in the 3rd chapter, on the power of the tongue. On why gossip can be such a deadly thing, about how James puts real emphasis on the tongue as a deadly weapon that can sink ships, it can destroy things. And so it alludes to the Sermon on the Mount over 20 times. So that is the book of James. That's why it was written. Now you can read the second book of the New Testament in a new historical context and understand who was writing it, why he was writing it, and who he was writing it to. So next week we will continue talking about the first 2 books of the Thessalonians. If you like this video, please hit the like button. Please hit subscribe. You can also follow me on Twitter at DepthsPentecost, or you can subscribe to my weekly blog series on my website, depthsofpentecost.com. Thanks for watching. God bless.